Hi, it's Michael. So I'm going to move on. We talked a little bit about nouns. It's a huge topic, and nouns are now going to move into verbs. Now, they're both words. So, what's the difference? Well, in this particular concept, and I can say that I kind of came up with this in a way just to help explain, and I did see some other people who are using this same concept. So, I feel pretty validated that it just helps separate the two. Nouns are those things that I believe describe and fill out your database. So they're really all related to your topic, and they all are going to provide more and more information that's relevant in terms of groups, in terms of details, all those things that we've explored in the prior videos. So all that stuff is to me nouns because they're really all focused on giving more and more detail to the topic that your data table is about. Verbs are different. In fact, the first verb and the real verb mechanisms we're going to go through, and we're going to go through a few different acronyms, a lot of acronyms here. We're going to talk about CRUD, we're going to talk about REST, APIs, and query strings, because you have to get your data out of that table. And actually, once you figure out how it really gets out of the table, I think you'll find, wow, this is really powerful, which it is. So, quick first start, hyperlinks. The reason we're all here, the reason why this exists, this hyperlinks are the reason information architecture exists. It's the reason why it's beyond. It's an amazing idea. And what a URL is, well, you might see them all the time, right? There they are. They're kind of blue. They have some underlines. You get to click on them. But that's the real key, is that clicking on them actually goes to someplace else. Not only does it go, well, actually, let's unpack that. So let's just take a really quick look. What does a hyperlink look like? The tag for a hyperlink is A, and that, going back to HTML, is just a tag like everything else, an A tag. But it does have this reference, href, which is hypertext reference, hypertext. There's a lot of very new words they were inventing here, but hypertext just means a URL or universal resource locator. So you go someplace and you use a protocol like HTTP, Hypertext Transfer Protocol. HTTPS is the secure version of that, meaning it's encrypted, so whatever. Then you go to a domain, and that domain comes from a domain server, which can say, hey, there's only so many words. They have to be unique. That's one absolutely important thing that we're going to get to in just a second, is uniqueness of words is still, it's really important. We talked a little bit about groupings, where you actually want many things to have the same name, so you can group them together. And here, things have to be unique because they're an address. Some unique values you might see are emails have to be unique. There's only one, and that's the way it works. Phone numbers are similar. There has to be only one. So rigidity here in coming up with ways to make sure things are unique hasn't been a big part of your data table yet. And if you go and put things in Airtable, nicely enough, Airtable is not going to hassle you too much. But when you get to actually querying, which we are in just 1 second, it does matter, and it does care, because it has to pull up a record, not the first record of many identical records. So query language, we're going to get in there in just a second. It's too much to get into what these domain names mean, other than the fact that there weren't enough of them at one point, and now there are too many of them. They weren't used very strategically very well, and also they cost money. There's a lot of problems. They do have to be unique, and therefore they are rare. So .com, I'm not going to get into it. Anyway, then you've gotten, by the way, this is located to a server by magic in many ways. It's a lot of references that are being handled by people. Anyway, it finally gets to your server, and in a folder, there's going to be a main folder that's going to be, hey, I'm stuff that you can serve up. And there might be a page in there. That page is likely called index.htm or HTM hypertext markup. In any case, I go to that folder, and just like any folder structure at this point, you've got words, you've got subfolders, and in this there's a subfolder called marketing, which also in it has a index.html. So if you're asking for these things, it just goes and hopefully all works out and gives you and serves up a page. Again, normally called index, but you can call them anything you like. So all these words are going to be important, and the naming conventions is really our goal for understanding what the information architect does. I'm going to go and look back in time at good old Yahoo, because Yahoo in the day was really just a bunch of links, and they led to more links. It was the same structure and idea of a directory. It's just a directory of terms. And yeah, that's what Yahoo used to look like. It was just a bunch of URLs. And they had these topics, which we have talked about just a minute ago, these different sections that were important then. And it also tried its best to put in some things like in the news. So that's where we want to start thinking about dynamic content. How does this dynamic content get there? Certainly you can just make this page and say get dynamic content and get 3 links. Fine. And you've got a table and a database that's going to serve up those 3 links, which all have URLs. Everything's great. So we just want to talk a little bit of database here. Databases have been around a lot longer than the internet has, but they do have actions and verbs that go with them, and these are definitely verbs. Create. Actually, read. Let's start with read because it's the easiest. Read is go through the table and put it all on the page for me to look at. Thank you very much. So you're going to read something from a database. When you read something from a database, for example, you might have an issue, which is, and we're going to put this in terms of a sitemap in a minute, but let's pretend you had a page, index HTML, and your topic was restaurants. We talked about restaurants, and we talked about how, hey, maybe there are restaurants in Chicago, but your table can contain restaurants from all over the world. So right now you're like, well, I just want to show Chicago. How would I do that? So you would give a query. You'd say, hey, I'm going to read all records where location equals Chicago. Pretty easy conceptually, right? Great. And it will do that. It's going to query Chicago. That's it. So that's read. I'll make it more complicated in just a second. If, for example, you wanted to add a new restaurant, so you'd use this create idea. Create. And create has some rules around it, around uniqueness. We called it a primary key, or we didn't, but it's called a primary key because what you want, we did mention it for a minute. We said, what values in this table, if I put them all together, would be unique? I'm using an example of music or songs. So if I put the 3 things together, a song title, a artist name, and an album name, if I put those 3 together, all those pieces of text, and called it my primary key and say there can be no duplication. There can't be another thing with these 3 values that are exactly the same. Would it work? Maybe not. I might need to add one more field, perhaps date, because perhaps I remastered this song. Everything about it's identical except the bit rate or something. Uniqueness is really important because as you query and you get more complicated queries, you don't ever want duplicates of things that are meaningful. And I can show some examples here of looking at those fields and then maybe going to a site like Discogs, where there is a lot of repetition of exactly the same song name in different album formats. Is that meaningful? Well, we can decide. So sometimes repetition and having, say, a primary key being not those 3 things is something we have to deal with in our interface. If you come up with the same record dozens of times, most people would find that to be wrong. Hey, I'm looking for a thing, not a bunch of examples of things. So we've got our creation. So creation has to do with making sure something is unique. Also, it's just an activity that the SQL server is there to do. It likes making new things. You can add new records all the time. You can do that. You can delete records, certainly. It also might have rules. I can't delete it if XYZ. And updating is another good one. So you're just taking one record and you're changing a field, you're adding more fields to it, etc. So these are just, the CRUD is there because we're going to get to So just to modernize that concept here, we're going to get into REST, which is exactly the same thing, except it happens through the querying, let's call it, because it's going to come through the URL. So that means in the data query itself, like I want page, what did we say? There's a page, restaurants. Yes, I'm just going to go to restaurants, but I'm going to add onto it a different protocol. I'm going to say, post, which means I'm going to take all the data, and then after that is going to be a lot of what's called a query string. It is hidden most of the time. You can't see it, but you can see it if you're looking for it. If you go through something other than the browser itself, you can see query strings. I'm going to show you one. But either way, if you go there through that method, it will update your database. Pretty neat. Also, you can obviously get things, and you can query things, and that's why queries, normally you can see them. You don't always have to hide things, because if you're going and looking at a URL, you might start to see some of these query strings. It does have this format. You might be able to see it, and it is really pretty easy to read. It's a little question mark after the page name, and then it just has a name value pair. So client is something and channel is something. That's all. So, and you can have as many of them as you want. You separate them by ands. So I know this was a lot to get into. You're talking about some technicalities of how servers work, how things are processed, how CRUD works, and databases are queried. The entire goal for an information architect is really to focus on the words. So this part one was a little bit of a mixture of using words to create something or to do something. And if you look through your table, you're going to find a lot of words and nouns, as we call them, that you're going to use, hopefully, to allow people to explore your content. So there's two levels of exploration. The next video is going to get into site mapping and where and how navigation works, where does it go, etc., things like that.